Well, I think that the Democracy Summit, both this year's and the previous one, need to be seen in the context of the Biden administration's overall foreign policy. And that foreign policy is one that really emphasizes the idea of democracy promotion. It's been a long time. You have to go back to the Clinton administration, maybe even to the Jimmy Carter administration, since you had a U.S. presidential administration that so explicitly focused on the democracy agenda. And again, the Biden administration has emphasized this idea that democracy, promoting democracy and rights abroad has to be a core pillar of U.S. foreign policy. So I think that this summit is meant to bring together the U.S. and what it views as key democracies to discuss the way forward to strengthen democracy. But of course, as you know, it's a very controversial thing because there's no one set view on what constitutes a democracy and what constitutes the right group of countries that should be joining the U.S. for this summit. Well, no, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that this is a summit that should be seen in a values-based context, in the sense that this is an attempt to bring together folks united in their view in promoting democracy, and that there's going to be an action plan for strengthening democracy. I really see this summit as much more geopolitical in nature. I mean, it's no coincidence that the U.S. excluded some of its biggest rivals, who happen to essentially not be democracies. So one can understand that. But I think that the idea here is for the administration, I think, to bring together what it views as like-minded countries, like-minded democracies, in order to help the U.S. push this agenda of not only promoting democracy, but also one that gets at really what constitutes the core of the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy, which is this idea of promoting a free, open, rules-based world, and that is inherently meant to be democracy-oriented. And obviously, China is the main target of that policy, in the sense that the U.S. believes that China does not reflect any of those values. So, I really think that there's going to be a very strong geopolitical tinge, but not just a tinge, a very strong geopolitical emphasis in this summit, in that the U.S. is trying to build a broader coalition, a broader group of countries to work with it to counter countries that it views not to be undemocratic, which again happens to include a key strategic rival like China, as well as obviously Russia and others as well. Well, I think it's a very fair point to question whether democracy is really something, or democratic principles are something that the U.S. is best placed to be promoting. At this juncture, at this summit, and more broadly, I mean, one could certainly argue with reason that the U.S. itself has experienced democratic backsliding in recent years, and it's still struggling to recover from the worst of that backsliding, which happened, in my view, during the Trump administration. So, yeah, as I said before, democracy is a relative term. It's a subjective term, should I say. Democratic principles are subjective, right? And I'm quite sure that what the U.S. views to be the core elements of democracy are not necessarily what even a key partner like India would regard as key, democratic principles. The U.S. has been critical of India, gently, but it has been critical of India for democratic backsliding there, particularly as evidenced by, increasing crackdowns on dissent and so on and so forth. But India, the official Indian reaction, and the reaction of many in India, is that no, India is not experiencing democratic backsliding, and the U.S. has no idea what it's talking about. So the broader point here is that democracy is a very delicate thing. And that's why when it comes to a democracy summit, especially one where only certain countries are invited, it's not an inclusive thing. It's not like if any head of state or head of government from any country wants to join in, they could just log into Zoom or whatever format is being used for the online elements of this. It's very narrowly focused, and that makes it political. That makes it polarizing when the U.S. is excluding a number of countries because, for whatever reason, it doesn't believe them to be democracies. It doesn't believe them to be worthy of participating for whatever reason. You could argue that in of itself is not democratic, right? That the U.S. makes a decision as to who it invites without being very transparent about the criteria for who's going to be invited. So I think that it's true that the notion of is this democracy summit really emphasizing democratic principles? Well, that's the idea, but I think one could certainly push back and say, well, it's such a delicate, subjective, contestable issue, this idea of democratic principles, that maybe it's one would struggle to make that argument.